I am Sharon Blake, and this is the story of how I spent 12 years being my husband's family's charity case before I finally learned to burn down their ivory tower like the peasant they always said I was. The champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the Stilton family's grand estate as my mother-in-law's words echoed through the crowded engagement party like a death sentence. Well, of course, we'll need to keep the wedding small and modest, Cara Stilton announced to her circle of well-dressed friends, her voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that only comes wrapped in silk and pearls. After all, Sharon has no family to invite anyway. Foster children rarely do. The laughter that followed wasn't the polite kind you hear at sophisticated gatherings. It was the sharp, cutting laughter of people who found someone beneath them to mock.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
I stood frozen in the doorway of the library, invisible in my discount dress store outfit, watching my future mother-in-law explain to her friends why her son Kevin's engagement party felt more like a funeral than a celebration. "The poor dear tries so hard," Cara continued, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet with the casual indifference of someone who'd never worried about money a day in her life. "But you simply can't buy breeding, can you? Kevin insists she's wonderful, but honestly, what kind of foundation can someone have when they've been bounced between foster homes like a ping-pong ball?" The laughter that followed wasn't the polite kind you hear at sophisticated gatherings. It was the sharp, cutting laughter of people who found someone beneath them to mock. I stood frozen in the doorway of the library, invisible in my discount dress store outfit, watching my future mother-in-law explain to her friends why her son Kevin's engagement party felt more like a funeral than a celebration. "The poor dear tries so hard," Cara continued, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet with the casual indifference of someone who'd never worried about money a day in her life. "But you simply can't buy breeding, can you? Kevin insists she's wonderful, but honestly, what kind of foundation can someone have when they've been bounced between foster homes like a ping-pong ball?" Mrs. Hawkins, the family's longtime friend and social equal, leaned in conspiratorially. "And I heard she was working as a nurse when Kevin met her. Very practical. Though I suppose when you come from nothing, you take whatever you can get." "Exactly," Cara said, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a whisper, but carried perfectly across the room. "No family money, no connections, no social standing. Kevin could have had his pick of any girl from the country club, girls with proper backgrounds and trust funds. Instead, he chooses this project." Project. The word hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs and making my knees weak. After 3 years of dating Kevin, after accepting his proposal just 6 months ago, after enduring countless family dinners where I was treated like an interesting specimen rather than a person, I'd finally heard the truth. I wasn't Kevin's fiancé to his family. I was his charity work. "The engagement ring is lovely, though," added Lizzie Hawkins, Cara's daughter and Kevin's childhood friend, who'd made it clear from day one that she thought Kevin was settling for someone far beneath his station. "Though I noticed it's not the family ring. That stayed safely in the vault, I assume." Cara's laugh was like broken glass. "Oh yes, the Stilton emerald will stay exactly where it belongs. Some traditions are too precious to risk on temporary arrangements." Temporary arrangements. My hand instinctively moved to the modest diamond solitaire on my finger, the ring Kevin had saved for months to buy, the ring I thought represented his love and commitment. Apparently, it represented something else entirely to his family. "Still," Mrs. Hawkins mused, "I suppose Kevin will come to his senses eventually. Men his age often go through these phases of wanting to rescue someone. It's rather sweet in a naive way." "Oh, absolutely," Cara agreed. "And when he does, we'll be right here to help him transition back to where he belongs. The Hartwell girl from the tennis club has been asking about him. Now that's the kind of match that makes sense. Old money, proper family, the right connections, everything Kevin needs for his political career. I backed away from the doorway, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure someone would hear it. 3 years. 3 years of trying to fit into a world that saw me as a temporary inconvenience. 3 years of enduring subtle insults, condescending explanations of social customs I supposedly couldn't understand, and constant reminders that I didn't belong. 3 years of believing that love could bridge the gap between Kevin's privileged background and my foster care upbringing. 3 years of telling myself that his family would eventually accept me if I just tried hard enough, dressed appropriately enough, spoke carefully enough. But standing in that hallway, listening to my future mother-in-law plan my eventual replacement, I realized I'd been playing a rigged game from the very beginning. The sound of footsteps on marble made me look up to see Kevin approaching, his face glowing with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. He looked impossibly handsome in his tailored tuxedo, every inch the golden boy his mother had raised him to be. "There you are," he said, reaching for my hand. "Mother's been looking for you. She wants to introduce you to the Hawkins family. They're old friends, very important in Father's business circles." I stared at this man I'd planned to marry, this man whose mother was already planning my replacement, this man who seemed completely oblivious to the fact that his family saw me as a temporary embarrassment to be endured. "Kevin," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper, "do you know what your mother really thinks of me?" His smile faltered slightly. "What do you mean? Mother adores you. She's always saying how unique you are." Unique. Not special, not wonderful, not perfect for her son. Unique, like an exotic animal in a zoo. "She thinks I'm temporary," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "She thinks you're going through a phase, and that you'll eventually come to your senses and marry someone from your own world." Kevin's laugh was uncomfortable, uncertain. "Sharon, that's ridiculous. You're being paranoid. Mother would never." "I heard her, Kevin, just now. She was telling Mrs. Hawkins about the Hartwell girl from the tennis club, about how that's the kind of match that makes sense for your political career." For a moment, something flickered across Kevin's face. Not surprise, not indignation, not the immediate defense of his fiancée that I'd expected. Just discomfort. The discomfort of someone who'd heard these conversations before and chosen not to share them with me. And in that moment, standing in the marble hallway of the Stilton estate, surrounded by the wealth and privilege I'd never be allowed to truly join, I realized that this engagement party wasn't the beginning of my fairy tale. It was the moment I finally understood I'd been living in someone else's nightmare all along. But let me back up and tell you how I got to that marble hallway in the first place, because the seeds of that humiliation were planted long before Kevin Stilton ever walked into St. Mary's Hospital on that rainy October morning 3 years earlier. My name is Sharon Blake, though Blake wasn't the name I was born with. That name got lost somewhere between my third and fourth foster home, along with most of my childhood memories and any sense of where I truly belonged in this world. By the time I aged out of the system at 18, I'd lived in 7 different homes, attended 12 different schools, and learned the most valuable lesson of my life. The only person you can truly count on is yourself. The state gave me the surname Blake when I was 14, after my last set of foster parents decided that a teenager with attitude problems was too much work for the monthly stipend they received. I kept the name because it felt clean, anonymous, like a fresh start with no baggage attached. Sharon Blake could be anyone, could become anything, could rise above the circumstances that had shaped her childhood. And for a while, it seemed like I was right. I put myself through nursing school working 3 part-time jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night, and living on ramen noodles and determination. I graduated with honors, passed my boards on the first try, and landed a position in the cardiac unit at St. Mary's Hospital. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was meaningful, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had a purpose beyond just surviving. I was good at nursing, more than good, actually. I had a gift for connecting with patients, for seeing past their fear and pain to the person underneath.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Maybe it was because I understood what it felt like to be alone and scared, to have no one advocating for you in a system that saw you as just another number. The other nurses respected me. The doctors trusted my judgment. I'd finally found a place where my background didn't matter, where my worth was measured by my competence and compassion rather than my family tree or bank account. Then, Kevin Stilton had his heart attack. He was 34 years old, a successful investment banker who'd been working 100-hour weeks and living on stress and caffeine. His body finally rebelled during a particularly intense client meeting, and he collapsed in the conference room of Stilton and Associates, the family firm his father had built from the ground up. I was assigned to his care during the week he spent in our cardiac unit, and from the moment he woke up asking if someone could call his secretary to reschedule his meetings, I knew he was different from our usual patients. Most people who'd just survived a heart attack were scared, humbled by their mortality. Kevin seemed more annoyed by the inconvenience. "This is ridiculous," he said on his second day, trying to remove his monitoring leads so he could get dressed. "I feel fine. I have a presentation to give this afternoon." "Mr. Stilton," I said, gently but firmly pressing him back into bed, "you had a massive heart attack 48 hours ago. You're not going anywhere for at least another week." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not pity, not condescension, not the polite disinterest I was used to from people in his social circle, just genuine attention. "You're not going to let me manipulate my way out of here, are you?" he asked, with what I would later learn was his most charming smile. "Not a chance," I replied. "I've dealt with much more intimidating people than you, Mr. Stilton." That made him laugh, a real laugh that transformed his entire face. "I doubt that. Do you know who my mother is?" I didn't, of course. The Stilton name meant nothing to me then. I was blissfully unaware that I was talking to the heir of one of the city's oldest and wealthiest families, that his mother was Kara Stilton, the woman whose charity galas made the society pages and whose opinions shaped the social hierarchy of our entire community. All I knew was that Kevin Stilton was a patient who needed to follow his recovery protocol, and I was the nurse responsible for making sure he did. Over the next 5 days, we talked, really talked. Kevin told me about the pressure of living up to family expectations, about feeling trapped in a life that had been planned for him before he was born. I told him about my work, about the satisfaction I found in helping people, about my small apartment and my quiet life that felt rich with possibility. He seemed fascinated by the idea of someone who'd built their life from nothing, who didn't have generations of family legacy weighing them down. I was charmed by his vulnerability, by the way he seemed to shed his polished exterior when it was just the two of us talking in the quiet hours of the night shift. When he asked me out after his discharge, I almost said no. I could see the expensive watch on his wrist, the handmade shoes, the way other staff members deferred to him with the automatic respect that comes from recognizing wealth and status. I knew we came from different worlds. But Kevin was persistent, and more importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in me as a person, not as a project or a curiosity. Our first date was dinner at a small Italian restaurant near the hospital, nothing fancy or intimidating. He asked about my work, my dreams, my thoughts on everything from politics to literature. He listened to my answers like they mattered. For 6 months, we existed in a beautiful bubble where our different backgrounds felt like an asset rather than an obstacle. Kevin seemed refreshed by my perspective, energized by my independence. I was enchanted by his intelligence, his ambition, his ability to see possibilities I'd never imagined. It wasn't until he first brought me to the Stilton estate for Sunday dinner that I realized how naive we'd both been. The first Sunday dinner at the Stilton estate should have been a warning, but I was too blinded by love and hope to read the signs correctly. Kevin picked me up in his BMW, and I'd spent hours choosing the perfect outfit, settling on a conservative navy dress that I'd splurged on specifically for the occasion. I wanted to make a good impression, to show his family that despite my humble background, I could fit into their world. The estate itself was intimidating enough. Rolling lawns, a circular driveway that could have accommodated a small wedding, and a house that looked like it belonged in a British period drama. Kevin seemed to shrink slightly as we pulled up to the front door, his earlier confidence replaced by something that looked almost like resignation. "Just remember," he said as we walked up the stone steps, "they can be a bit traditional. Don't take anything personally." I should have asked him what that meant, but the massive oak door was already opening to reveal Arthur Stilton, Kevin's father. He was an imposing man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of stern expression that suggested he'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with money or influence. "Kevin," he said, his voice cordial but distant, "and this must be Sharon." The way he said my name made it sound like he was trying it out, testing how it felt in his mouth and finding it slightly distasteful. But he shook my hand politely and invited us inside, and I tried to convince myself that first impressions could be misleading. Kara Stilton was waiting in the sitting room, a vision of elegant intimidation in cream-colored silk and pearls that probably cost more than my monthly salary. She rose gracefully as we entered, her smile perfectly calibrated to appear welcoming while somehow managing to make me feel like an intruder. "Sharon, darling," she said, extending a manicured hand, "Kevin has told us so much about you. How lovely that you're a nurse, such important work, and so selfless." The pause before selfless lasted just long enough to make it clear that she considered this a character flaw rather than a virtue. But she guided me to a chair with apparent warmth, asking about my work and my background with what seemed like genuine interest. It wasn't until the questions kept coming that I realized I was being interviewed. "And you grew up here in the city?" Kara asked, settling into her own chair with practiced grace. "Yes, mostly," I replied carefully. "I moved around quite a bit as a child." "Oh, military family?" Arthur inquired from his position by the fireplace. "Not exactly," I said, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. "I was in foster care." The silence that followed was brief but profound. Arthur's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Kara's smile never wavered, but it somehow became less warm, more calculating. "How interesting," Kara said finally. "That must have been quite challenging. And your parents?" "I don't know much about them," I admitted, hating how small my voice sounded in the elegant room. "I was very young when I went into the system." Kevin reached over and squeezed my hand, but even his support felt inadequate against the weight of his parents' scrutiny. They continued asking questions throughout dinner, probing politely but persistently about my education, my finances, my plans for the future. Each answer seemed to confirm something they'd already suspected about me. But it was after dinner, when Kevin excused himself to take a phone call and left me alone with his parents, that I got my first real taste of what the next 3 years would hold. "Sharon," said, settling beside me on the sofa with tea that I suspected was worth more than my car, "I hope you won't think me impertinent, but I feel I should share some thoughts about Kevin." "Of course," I said, though every instinct I'd developed in foster care was screaming at me to be careful. "Kevin is a wonderful young man, but he can be quite impulsive, especially when it comes to relationships." She sipped her tea delicately. "He has such a generous heart, always wanting to help people who are less fortunate." Less fortunate. The phrase hit me like a slap, but Kara continued as if she'd said something perfectly normal. "Arthur and I have always been proud of Kevin's charitable nature, but we've learned to be cautious about people who might take advantage of his kindness. I'm sure you understand." I understood perfectly. She was telling me, with exquisite politeness, that she considered me a gold digger, that my interest in Kevin was financial rather than romantic, that I was the kind of person who took advantage of generous hearts. "Mrs. Stilton," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I want you to know that I care about Kevin very much. I'm not interested in his money." "Oh, my dear," Kara laughed, a sound like expensive crystal breaking. "I'm sure you believe that, but you have to understand, Kevin has been targeted before by women who saw him as an opportunity rather than a person. It's simply the reality of his position." Arthur joined the conversation then, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "What Kara is trying to say, Sharon, is that we hope you'll be realistic about this relationship. Kevin needs someone who can match his social position, someone who can be an asset to his career and our family's reputation. Someone with the right background," Kara added gently, "someone who understands our world and can navigate it effectively." The message was crystal clear. I was not that someone. I would never be that someone. And they expected me to gracefully remove myself from Kevin's life before I caused any permanent damage to his prospects. When Kevin returned from his phone call, his parents smoothly shifted back to polite conversation, asking about my work schedule and expressing concern about how demanding nursing could be. To anyone listening, they sounded like caring future in-laws worried about their son's girlfriend's well-being. But I heard the subtext now. They were planting seeds, suggesting that my career would be an obstacle to a relationship with their son, that my demanding schedule would prevent me from being the kind of partner Kevin needed. The drive home was quiet. Kevin seemed distracted, and I was too shaken by the conversation to know what to say. Finally, as we pulled into my apartment complex, he turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "So," he said, "what did you think of them?" I looked at this man I was falling in love with, this man whose parents had just made it clear that I would never be good enough for their family, and I made a decision that would haunt me for the next 3 years. I decided to fight for him. "They're lovely," I lied. "I can see where you get your intelligence and charm." Kevin smiled, relief evident on his face. "I'm so glad you think so. They really liked you too. Mother mentioned how impressed she was with your dedication to your work." And there it was. Kevin had either completely missed his parents' message, or he'd chosen to interpret their polite hostility as approval. Either way, I realized that I was on my own in this battle for acceptance. Over the next 6 months, as Kevin and I grew closer and our relationship became more serious, I threw myself into the impossible task of winning over his family. I studied etiquette books, learned about wine and art and classical music. I bought clothes I couldn't afford and practiced conversation topics that would make me seem more sophisticated. At every family gathering, I smiled through subtle insults disguised as compliments. I accepted advice about how to improve myself with grace and gratitude. I allowed myself to be positioned as the grateful recipient of their guidance and wisdom, always the student, never the equal. And slowly, insidiously, I began to believe their version of reality. Maybe I was lucky that Kevin had chosen me. Maybe I should be grateful for the chance to elevate myself through association with his family. Maybe love really could overcome the vast differences in our backgrounds if I just worked hard enough to bridge the gap. It took 3 years of this treatment before I finally understood what I should have seen from that very first Sunday dinner. I wasn't being accepted into the Stilton family. I was being slowly and systematically broken down by it. The crack in my carefully constructed denial began during Kevin's cousin Reggie's wedding reception at the Hawkins Country Club. It was our second year together, and I'd finally started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I was making progress with his family. Kara had complimented my dress that evening, and Arthur had actually asked my opinion about a proposed healthcare initiative his company was considering funding. I was standing near the champagne fountain, chatting with some of Kevin's extended family, when I excused myself to use the restroom. That's when I overheard the conversation that would shatter my illusions about how well I was fitting in. The women's lounge at the country club was elegantly appointed with individual stalls that offered complete privacy, which meant the 3 women talking at the vanity area had no idea I was there. I recognized the voices immediately. Kara Stilton, Mrs. Hawkins, and Rhea Link, one of Kara's closest friends from the charity circuit. Well, I have to admit, Mrs. Hawkins was saying, she's certainly making an effort. That dress tonight actually looks like it came from somewhere decent. Oh, yes, Kara replied, and I could hear the sound of lipstick being applied. We've been working with her on her wardrobe choices. She's quite teachable, really, like training a puppy. My blood turned to ice. Like training a puppy? Still, Rhea Link added with a laugh, you have to wonder how long Kevin will maintain this little social experiment. Men his age often go through phases of wanting to rescue someone. It's quite sweet, actually. Arthur thinks it's good for him, Kara said. Kevin's always been a bit sheltered, you know. Dating someone from that background is teaching him about the real world. It's like a controlled exposure to, well, to how the other half lives. Controlled exposure. As if I were a vaccine against privilege, a small dose of poverty injected into Kevin's life to build his immunity to real hardship. But surely he's not serious about her, Mrs. Hawkins pressed. I mean, for anything permanent. There was a pause, and I held my breath, waiting for Kara's response. Oh, I don't think so, she finally said. Kevin's much too practical for that. He knows what his responsibilities are, what kind of wife would actually benefit his career and our family's position. This Sharon person is, well, she's lovely for what she is, but she's hardly marriage material for someone in Kevin's position. What does Arthur think? Rhea asked.
Arthur's confident that Kevin will come to his senses naturally. We just need to be patient and supportive while he works through this phase. In the meantime, the girl seems harmless enough. She's actually quite useful at family functions, always offering to help with coats and cleanup. It's rather nice having someone around who's comfortable with that sort of work. The women laughed, and I heard the sound of purses being snapped shut and heels clicking toward the door. I sat in that bathroom stall for another 10 minutes, trying to process what I'd just heard. A phase? A social experiment? Someone who was comfortable with cleanup work because that's all I was good for. When I finally emerged and rejoined the reception, I felt like I was seeing everything through new eyes. Kevin was at our table, laughing with his cousins about some story from their prep school days. When he saw me approaching, he smiled and pulled out my chair. But I noticed he didn't pause his story to include me. I was simply expected to sit quietly and listen to tales from a world I'd never been part of. Later that evening, when Reggie's new bride threw her bouquet, it landed directly in my hands. The crowd cheered and Kevin grinned, but I caught the look that passed between Kara and Arthur. It wasn't the indulgent smile of future in-laws watching their son's girlfriend catch the bouquet. It was the resigned expression of people watching someone embarrass themselves without realizing it. Looks like you're next, Kevin said, kissing my cheek as the photographer snapped pictures. But as I looked at the bouquet in my hands, all I could think about was Kara's words. Kevin's much too practical for that. The second crack came a month later during a dinner party at the Stilton estate. Kara had invited several prominent couples from their social circle, and I'd spent days researching current events and cultural topics so I could contribute meaningfully to the conversation. The evening started well enough. I managed to hold my own in discussions about the local art scene and even impressed Arthur's business partner with my knowledge of healthcare policy. I was feeling more confident than I had in months when Sharon Blake, a prominent lawyer and old family friend, arrived late and slightly intoxicated. "Kevin!" Sharon boomed, embracing him warmly. "And this must be the famous Sharon we've all heard so much about." The way he said famous made my skin crawl, but I smiled and shook his hand politely. "So, tell me, Sharon," Sharon continued, his voice carrying across the room, "Kevin's mother tells me you've quite an interesting background. Foster care, wasn't it? How unique." The conversation around the dinner table stopped. Every eye in the room was on me, and I felt like a specimen under a microscope. "Yes," I said simply, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was in the foster system as a child." "Fascinating," Sharon said, settling into his chair with the satisfaction of someone who just introduced his favorite party trick.
I've done some pro bono work with the family court system. Tragic cases, really. Children from such unfortunate circumstances. Drug-addicted parents, abuse, neglect. The damage is often irreversible. I felt Kevin tense beside me, but he didn't speak up to redirect the conversation. Carson, Kara said mildly, perhaps we could discuss something more pleasant over dinner? But Carson was warming to his topic. No, I think it's important to acknowledge these things. Sharon's story is quite inspiring, really. To come from that kind of background and still manage to make something of herself. Nursing, isn't it? Very admirable for someone with your origins. The word origins hung in the air like a toxic cloud, as if my foster care background were a genetic defect that I'd somehow managed to overcome through sheer force of will. I imagine, Carson continued, that being with Kevin has opened up a whole new world for you. Must be quite overwhelming at times, all this. He gestured around the elegant dining room. I suppose it's like Pygmalion in a way, Kevin sculpting you into something more refined. The comparison to Pygmalion hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't a person in Carson's estimation. I was a project, raw material that Kevin was molding into something more acceptable. I looked around the table, waiting for someone to challenge Carson's assessment, to defend me against his casual cruelty. But no one spoke. Kevin was staring at his plate, his face flushed with embarrassment. Kara was sipping her wine with studied neutrality. Arthur was cutting his steak with mechanical precision. They were all comfortable with this conversation because it reflected what they truly believed about me. That night, as Kevin drove me home, I waited for him to apologize for Carson's behavior, to express outrage at how I'd been treated in his family's home. Instead, he said, Carson can be a bit much when he's been drinking. I hope you didn't take anything he said too seriously. Kevin, I said carefully, he basically called me damaged goods who should be grateful for the chance to be improved by association with your family. Kevin was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You know Carson didn't mean it that way. He's actually quite progressive on social issues. He was trying to compliment your resilience. And there it was. Kevin's willingness to reinterpret obvious insults as misunderstood compliments, to gaslight me into accepting mistreatment as kindness. That was the night I first wondered if I was fighting a battle I could never win. But I was still too invested, too hopeful, too determined to prove myself worthy of love, to recognize that the problem wasn't my background or my efforts. The problem was that I was trying to earn acceptance from people who had already decided I would never deserve it.
By our third year together, the pattern of subtle degradation had become so normalized that I barely noticed it anymore. I'd learned to smile through comments about my humble origins and to graciously accept advice about everything from my posture to my pronunciation. I'd become an expert at reading the room, knowing exactly when to speak and when to remain silent, when to offer help and when to stay invisible. But the evidence was accumulating, building into a mountain of proof that I was too emotionally invested to see clearly. The Christmas gift incident should have been my wake-up call. Kevin and I had been invited to spend Christmas Eve at the Stilton estate, a tradition that apparently went back generations. I'd agonized over what to give his parents, finally settling on a beautiful leather-bound first edition of Arthur's favorite classic novel that had cost me nearly 2 weeks' salary. Christmas morning at the Stilton house was like something out of a magazine spread. The tree was professionally decorated, the gifts were elegantly wrapped, and everyone gathered in the sitting room wearing coordinated outfits that looked effortlessly expensive. I watched as Arthur unwrapped cashmere scarves and vintage wines, as Kara exclaimed over jewelry and art pieces. When Arthur opened my carefully chosen gift, he examined it politely and thanked me with the same tone he might use to acknowledge a tip from a service worker. "How thoughtful," he said, setting it aside without really looking at it. "Kevin, didn't you mention Sharon enjoys reading? Perhaps she'd appreciate this." He handed me a small wrapped box, and I opened it to find a gift card to a discount bookstore chain.
Not even a physical book, just a plastic card worth $25 to a store where college students bought used textbooks. The contrast was devastating. I'd given Arthur a rare first edition worth hundreds of dollars. He'd given me a gift card that suggested he knew absolutely nothing about my interests, education, or literary preferences. It was the kind of generic gift you'd give to someone you barely knew and cared about even less. But Kevin seemed oblivious to the insult. "That's perfect," he said cheerfully. "You're always reading those medical journals. Now you can get some fun books, too." Fun books. As if my graduate-level medical education hadn't already introduced me to the concept of recreational reading. The Valentine's Day disaster was even worse. Kevin had planned what he called a romantic surprise, dinner at an exclusive restaurant that required reservations months in advance. I was excited about having his undivided attention for an entire evening, away from his family's constant scrutiny. But when we arrived at the restaurant, I discovered we weren't dining alone. Kara and Arthur were already seated at a table for four, having apparently orchestrated this romantic dinner as another opportunity to supervise our relationship. "Surprise," Kara said brightly as Kevin and I approached the table. "Arthur and I thought it would be lovely to celebrate with you both. After all, family should share special moments together." The evening was a masterclass in passive-aggressive control. Kara dominated the conversation, steering it toward topics that highlighted my lack of cultural sophistication. Arthur made pointed comments about the importance of appropriate partnerships in professional advancement. They ordered wine without consulting me, chose appetizers I was allergic to, and somehow managed to turn my romantic Valentine's dinner into a performance review of my suitability as Kevin's girlfriend. The worst part was Kevin's response to the hijacking of our evening. When I mentioned later that I'd been looking forward to spending time alone with him, he seemed genuinely confused by my disappointment. "But we did spend time together," he said, "and my parents made such an effort to include you. I thought you'd be pleased that they wanted to celebrate with us." Include me? As if crashing our romantic dinner was an act of generosity rather than control. The final straw in this series of accumulated humiliations came during Easter dinner at the estate. I'd been dating Kevin for almost 3 years by then, and I'd started to hope that maybe I was finally being accepted as a permanent part of the family. That hope was crushed when Lizzie Hawkins arrived with her parents and immediately launched into an enthusiastic description of her recent promotion at the art gallery where she worked. "It's such exciting news," Kara said, beaming at Lizzie like a proud mother. "The gallery's expanding their contemporary collection, and Lizzie will be curating the entire project. Such a wonderful opportunity for someone so young and talented." Everyone gathered around Lizzie, asking questions about her work, her artistic vision, her plans for the exhibition. It was like watching a family rally around one of their own, providing support and encouragement for professional success. Then, almost as an afterthought, Kara turned to me and said, "And how are things at the hospital, Sharon? Still enjoying your work?" The pause before work was subtle but unmistakable. The implication was clear. What Lizzie did was a career, a calling, something worthy of respect and investment. What I did was merely a job, something to be tolerated but not celebrated. "Actually," I said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice, "I've been accepted into the graduate program for nurse practitioner certification. It's a significant step toward advancing my career in cardiac care." The silence that followed was deafening. No one asked about the program, the timeline, or what this advancement would mean for my professional development. Instead, Arthur cleared his throat and changed the subject to golf. Later that evening, as Kevin and I prepared to leave, Kara pulled me aside for what she called a private chat. "Sharon, dear," she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound concerned rather than critical, "I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I wanted to mention something about your graduate program." "Of course," I said, though my stomach was already clenching with dread. "It's wonderful that you're so dedicated to your profession, truly admirable, but I hope you're considering how demanding such a program might be, especially if you and Kevin are thinking about a more serious future together." She let that implication hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Marriage and family require such focus and energy, you understand, and Kevin's career is at such a crucial stage. He needs a partner who can be fully present for the social obligations and family responsibilities that come with his position. The message was crystal clear. My professional ambitions were incompatible with being Kevin's wife. I was being asked to choose between advancing my career and maintaining my relationship with their son. As I drove home that night, I finally allowed myself to see the pattern that had been building for 3 years. I wasn't being slowly accepted into the Stilton family. I was being systematically positioned as a temporary placeholder until Kevin found someone more suitable. Someone with the right background, the right connections, the right willingness to subordinate her own ambitions to his family's expectations. Someone who wasn't me. The moment that shattered my willingness to accept their treatment came exactly 3 months before that devastating engagement party conversation. It was a Tuesday evening in late February when I received the call that changed everything, not just about my relationship with the Stiltons, but about how I saw myself. I was working a double shift in the cardiac unit when my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have answered during work hours, but something made me step into the break room and take the call. "Is this Sharon Blake?" The voice was professional but warm, belonging to a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Chen from the American Cardiac Association. "Yes, this is Sharon," I replied, confused about why such a prestigious organization would be calling me. "Miss Blake, I'm calling with some wonderful news. Your research proposal on postoperative cardiac rehabilitation protocols has been selected for our annual innovation grant. You've been awarded $50,000 to implement your program, along with an invitation to present your findings at our national conference in Chicago." I sat down heavily in the break room chair, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Dr. Chen laughed kindly. "You've won one of the most competitive grants in cardiac nursing, Sharon. Your proposal was selected from over 800 submissions nationwide. The review board was particularly impressed with your innovative approach to patient care and the statistical improvements you documented in your pilot program." The grant? I'd submitted the application 6 months earlier, working on it during my breaks and days off, never really believing I had a chance. It was a research project I'd developed based on my work with cardiac patients, a comprehensive rehabilitation program that combined medical monitoring with psychological support and family education. "This is incredible," I managed to say. "I can't believe it." "Believe it," Dr. Chen said warmly. "You're about to become a nationally recognized expert in your field. The conference presentation alone will open doors for you that you probably haven't even imagined yet." After hanging up, I sat in that break room for 20 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't just recognition of my work. It was validation that I was intelligent, innovative, and capable of achievements that had nothing to do with my background or my relationship with Kevin. I was somebody in my own right. The first person I wanted to call was Kevin. Despite everything his family had put me through, I still loved him, and I wanted to share this moment of triumph with the man I was planning to marry. "Kevin," I said when he answered, barely able to contain my excitement, "you'll never guess what just happened." "Sharon, you sound strange. Is everything okay?" His voice was distracted, and I could hear the familiar sounds of the trading floor in the background. "Everything's perfect. I just received the most amazing news. I won the American Cardiac Association Innovation Grant, $50,000, Kevin, and I get to present at the national conference in Chicago." There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "That's great, Sharon, really great. Look, I'm in the middle of a client call. Can we talk about this later?" "Of course," I said, though my excitement dimmed slightly. "I just wanted to share the news with you first." "Right, yes, congratulations. I'll call you tonight, okay?" He hung up, and I stared at my phone, feeling deflated. This was the biggest professional achievement of my life, and Kevin had responded like I'd told him I'd won a raffle at the grocery store. But I pushed those feelings aside. Kevin was busy, I reasoned. He'd be more enthusiastic when he had time to really process the news. That evening, Kevin did call back, and he did offer more substantial congratulations. He took me to dinner to celebrate, ordered champagne, and seemed genuinely proud of my achievement. I started to feel guilty for doubting his support. "You should tell my parents about this," he said over dessert. "They'll be so impressed."
The next Sunday, I arrived at the Stilton estate for our regular family dinner, armed with my news. I'd printed out the official letter from the American Cardiac Association, and I'd prepared a brief explanation of what the grant meant for my career and the field of cardiac nursing. I waited until after dinner, when the conversation had turned to various family members' professional updates, to share my news. "I have some exciting news to share," I said, producing the letter with a smile I couldn't suppress. "I've been awarded a national research grant from the American Cardiac Association." I handed Arthur the letter and explained the significance of the award, the competitive selection process, and the opportunities it would create for advancing patient care. Arthur read the letter carefully, his expression neutral. Kara leaned over to read it as well, her face showing polite interest but nothing approaching enthusiasm. "How nice," Kara said finally. "What a lovely recognition of your dedication." That pause before dedication was like a knife to my heart. This wasn't dedication she was acknowledging, it was the most prestigious award in my field, recognition of genuine innovation and expertise. "The grant is for $50,000, I said, emphasizing the magnitude of the achievement, and I'll be presenting my research to over 3,000 cardiac care professionals from around the world." "50,000, Arthur mused. "That's quite generous for a nursing project." A nursing project? As if my research were a craft fair entry rather than a scientifically rigorous study that had passed peer review by some of the most respected cardiologists in the country. "Will this require you to travel much?" Kara asked, and I could hear the disapproval already forming in her voice. "Just to Chicago for the conference in June," I replied. "Chicago?" she repeated, as if I'd announced plans to move to Mars. "How long will you be away?" 4 days. Kara and Arthur exchanged one of their meaningful looks. "Well," Arthur said, setting down the letter, "I suppose it's flattering that they've taken notice of your work, though I do hope this won't interfere with your other responsibilities." Other responsibilities? He meant my responsibilities to Kevin, to the family, to being the kind of partner who didn't pursue achievements that might overshadow her place in the social hierarchy. That night, as Kevin drove me home, I waited for him to acknowledge what his parents' response had revealed. I waited for him to express outrage that they diminished my achievement, to defend my intelligence and capabilities against their casual dismissal. Instead, he said, "See, I told you they'd be impressed. Father called it quite generous, and you know how rarely he compliments anyone." I stared at Kevin in disbelief. "Kevin, your father just called the most significant professional achievement of my life a nursing project. Your mother acted like a 4-day conference trip was an abandonment of my duties. How is any of that impressive or supportive?" Kevin was quiet for a moment, then said the words that finally broke something irreparable inside me. "Sharon, I think you might be reading too much into their reaction. They're just not familiar with nursing awards. They meant well." In that moment, sitting in Kevin's car outside my apartment building, I finally understood the truth I'd been avoiding for 3 years. Kevin wasn't going to protect me from his family's contempt because he shared it. He loved me despite what he saw as my limitations, not because of my strengths. And I was never going to be more than a charity case in their eyes, no matter what I achieved. The engagement party 3 months later was just the final confirmation of what I'd already learned that night. I was planning to marry into a family that would spend the rest of my life making me feel small. Walking away from that overheard conversation at the engagement party felt like stepping through a portal into a different version of myself. For 3 years, I'd absorbed their insults, swallowed their condescension, and twisted myself into increasingly smaller shapes to fit their expectations.
but standing in that marble hallway, listening to my future mother-in-law plan my replacement, something fundamental shifted inside me. I was done apologizing for existing. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It started with small acts of rebellion that felt revolutionary after years of compliance. The first test came just 2 weeks after the engagement party, when Kara called to invite me to what she called a pre-wedding planning session at the country club. "We'll be meeting with the wedding coordinator to discuss venues and themes," she said in her perfectly modulated voice. "I've taken the liberty of making some initial selections based on what would be most appropriate for the family." In the past, I would have thanked her profusely for taking charge, would have expressed gratitude for her expertise and connections. Instead, I found myself saying something that surprised us both. "Actually, Kevin and I have decided to handle our own wedding planning. We appreciate the offer, but we want this to be our day, planned according to our vision." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. "I'm sorry," Kara said finally, her voice carrying a note of confusion. "Did you say you're declining our help? Sharon, dear, I think you might not understand how these things work in families like ours. There are expectations, traditions, social obligations that need to be considered." "I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "And Kevin agreed to this." The disbelief in her voice was unmistakable.
That was the question I'd been dreading, because Kevin hadn't exactly agreed to anything. We hadn't discussed wedding planning at all since the engagement party. But something told me that if I backed down now, I'd never find the courage to stand up to them again. "Kevin supports whatever makes me happy," I said, hoping it was true. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of direct confrontation. I'd never spoken to Kara that way before, had never challenged her authority or questioned her judgment. Part of me expected the apartment building to collapse from the sheer audacity of it. Instead, nothing happened. The world continued turning. The sky didn't fall. And I realized that Kara Stilton's disapproval, which had terrified me for 3 years, was actually powerless to hurt me unless I gave it that power. The second test came a week later when Arthur called with what he presented as a generous offer. "Sharon," he said in his authoritative voice, "Kara and I have been discussing your career situation, and we'd like to make a proposal that we think would benefit everyone involved." Career situation? As if my nationally recognized expertise in cardiac nursing were a problem to be solved rather than an achievement to be celebrated. "I'm listening," I said, though every instinct was already preparing for battle. "We understand that you're very dedicated to your work, and that's admirable. But with the engagement and upcoming wedding, perhaps it's time to consider a transition that would better suit your new role in the family." He paused, clearly expecting me to ask what kind of transition he had in mind. "Arthur," I said instead, "are you suggesting I should quit my job?" "Not quit, exactly, but perhaps something less demanding, more flexible. Kara knows several ladies who do charitable work, volunteer nursing at fundraising events, that sort of thing. Very rewarding, and it would allow you more time to focus on supporting Kevin's career and managing family obligations." Volunteer nursing at fundraising events? He wanted me to abandon my profession to become an unpaid accessory to his family's social calendar. "Arthur," I said, my voice deadly calm, "I've spent 12 years building my career. I've just received national recognition for my research. I'm not going to throw that away to hand out Band-Aids at charity galas." The shocked silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about how unusual it was for someone to refuse Arthur Stilton's generous offers. "Sharon," he said finally, his tone shifting from paternal to stern, "I think you may be overestimating the long-term viability of your current position. Nursing is a wonderful profession for young, single women, but marriage changes priorities. Kevin needs a wife who can be a true partner in building his future, not someone distracted by demanding work schedules." He paused, clearly expecting me to ask what kind of transition he had in mind. "Arthur," I said instead, "are you suggesting I should quit my job?"
Not quit, exactly, but perhaps something less demanding, more flexible. Kara knows several ladies who do charitable work, volunteer nursing at fundraising events, that sort of thing. Very rewarding, and it would allow you more time to focus on supporting Kevin's career and managing family obligations. Volunteer nursing at fundraising events? He wanted me to abandon my profession to become an unpaid accessory to his family's social calendar. Arthur, I said, my voice deadly calm, I've spent 12 years building my career. I've just received national recognition for my research. I'm not going to throw that away to hand out Band-Aids at charity galas. The shocked silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about how unusual it was for someone to refuse Arthur Stilton's generous offers. Sharon, he said finally, his tone shifting from paternal to stern, I think you may be overestimating the long-term viability of your current position. Nursing is a wonderful profession for young single women, but marriage changes priorities. Kevin needs a wife who can be a true partner in building his future, not someone distracted by demanding work schedules. Then maybe Kevin should marry someone else, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Another silence, this one even more profound. I think, Arthur said slowly, that perhaps you're feeling overwhelmed by all the changes. Wedding planning can be very stressful for someone who's never managed such a significant social event. Why don't you take some time to consider our offer? Discuss it with Kevin. I'm sure he'll help you see the wisdom in our suggestion. After that conversation, I knew the battle lines had been drawn. Arthur and Kara weren't just trying to control my wedding. They were trying to control my entire future, to reshape me into the kind of wife they deemed appropriate for their son. The confrontation I'd been avoiding for 3 years was finally here. That evening, I called Kevin and asked him to come over. It was time to discover whether my fiancé was my ally or my enemy in this war for my identity. Kevin, I said when he arrived, we need to talk about your parents. He settled onto my couch with the wary expression of someone who sensed trouble. What about them? They want me to quit my job. They want to plan our wedding. They want to control every aspect of our life together, and I'm not going to let that happen. Kevin was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing this information. Sharon, he said finally, I know my parents can be a bit involved, but they mean well. They just want what's best for us. What's best for them, or what's best for them? I don't see the difference. We're going to be family, Sharon. That means considering everyone's needs, not just our own. I stared at this man I'd been planning to marry, searching his face for any sign that he understood what his parents were asking me to sacrifice. Kevin, I said slowly, your father wants me to give up my career to volunteer at charity events. Your mother wants to plan our wedding according to what's appropriate for the family. When exactly do my needs get considered in this equation? That's not fair, Kevin said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. My parents have been nothing but generous to you. They've included you in family events, they've tried to help you fit in, they've offered to support our wedding. All they're asking is that you meet them halfway. Halfway? As if abandoning my professional identity were a reasonable compromise. And what are they giving up? I asked. What are they sacrificing to meet me halfway? Kevin looked genuinely confused by the question, as if the idea of his parents making concessions were incomprehensible. That's when I knew I was truly alone in this fight. Kevin, I said quietly, I need you to choose. Me or them. My career or their expectations. My dreams or their vision of what your wife should be. Why does it have to be a choice? He asked, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. Why can't we just work together to find a solution that makes everyone happy? Because some battles can't be won with compromise. Because some people will never see you as an equal, no matter how much you bend. Because sometimes love means protecting your partner from their own family's toxicity, even when they don't want to be protected. But looking at Kevin's face, I realized he would never understand any of that. He would always choose the path of least resistance, even if it meant sacrificing my happiness for his family's approval. And I was finally done being the sacrifice. The discovery that changed everything came 3 weeks after my ultimatum to Kevin, hidden in the most unlikely place imaginable. I was helping Kara organize files for a charity auction when I stumbled across information that revealed the true scope of the Stilton family's deception. Kevin had responded to our confrontation with his typical approach, avoidance disguised as diplomacy. He'd promised to talk to his parents about finding a middle ground, assured me that we could work everything out, and suggested we take a break from wedding planning until emotions cooled down. It was classic Kevin, managing the situation instead of addressing it. But Kara had taken a different approach. 2 days after my conversation with Kevin, she'd called with an invitation that sounded suspiciously like an olive branch. "Sharon, darling," she'd said in her most maternal tone, "I've been thinking about our recent misunderstanding, and I believe I may have been too presumptuous about the wedding planning. Perhaps we could work together on something smaller first to practice collaborating?" The something smaller turned out to be the annual Stilton Foundation charity auction, a high society event that raised money for various causes while providing networking opportunities for the city's elite. Kara needed help organizing donor files and auction items, and she presented it as a chance for us to bond while I learned more about the family's philanthropic work. I should have been suspicious of her sudden change in attitude, but I was desperate for any sign that peace might be possible, so I agreed to spend my Saturday afternoon at the estate helping sort through boxes of paperwork in Arthur's study. The study was Arthur's private domain, a mahogany-paneled room lined with law books and family photographs that screamed old money and established power. Kara had set up our workspace at a long table covered with donor lists, tax documents, and correspondence related to the foundation's activities. For the first 2 hours, everything proceeded normally. Kara was unusually warm and talkative, sharing stories about past auctions and pointing out the social connections represented in the donor files. She seemed genuinely interested in teaching me about the family's philanthropic work, and I began to hope that maybe this collaboration could be the fresh start we needed. Then I found the folder. It was misfiled in a stack of auction correspondence, labeled simply "Background Research" in Arthur's neat handwriting. I assumed it contained information about potential donors or auction items, so I opened it without thinking twice. Instead, I found a comprehensive investigation report about me. The folder contained copies of my employment records, credit reports, medical history, and educational transcripts. There were photographs of my apartment building, my workplace, and even my car. Most disturbing of all, there were detailed reports about every foster family I'd lived with, including interviews with my former social workers and psychological evaluations from my childhood that I'd never shared with anyone, including Kevin. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. At the bottom of the folder was a second investigation report, this one dated just 6 months ago. It wasn't about my past, it was about my present. The private investigator had been tracking my daily routines, documenting my friendships, and even interviewing my colleagues at the hospital under the pretense of conducting a background check for a potential job opportunity. They knew about my research grant before I'd even told Kevin. They knew about my graduate school plans, my financial situation, and my professional reputation. Most chilling of all, they knew about Dr. Patricia Chen's offer to recommend me for a prestigious fellowship position that I'd mentioned to exactly one person, my closest friend at the hospital. The report concluded with a section titled "Recommendations" that made my blood run cold. Subject demonstrates significant professional ambition that may conflict with traditional family role expectations. Intelligence and achievements likely to create social complications within established family hierarchy. Recommend continued monitoring and strategic intervention to manage career trajectory and social integration. Strategic intervention to manage my career trajectory. They weren't just disapproving of my professional success, they were actively planning to sabotage it. I was still staring at the documents in shock when I heard Kara's voice behind me. "Oh dear," she said, her tone carrying none of its earlier warmth. The mask had finally slipped, revealing the calculating woman underneath. "You had me investigated," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Of course we did," Kara replied, settling into one of the leather chairs with perfect composure. "Did you really think we'd allow Kevin to marry someone without thoroughly understanding who she was? We have a family reputation to protect."
This is illegal. You accessed my medical records, my employment files. Nothing illegal about hiring a private investigator to gather publicly available information, Kara interrupted smoothly. And the rest? Well, you'd be surprised what people will share when they think they're helping someone get a job. I looked back at the folder, seeing my entire life reduced to data points and risk assessments. You've been planning to get rid of me from the beginning. Not get rid of exactly, manage. We knew Kevin would eventually come to his senses, but we wanted to be prepared for various contingencies. Contingencies? Kara smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen on another human being. What if you got pregnant before Kevin realized his mistake? What if you tried to manipulate him financially? What if your colorful background became public and embarrassed the family? We needed to understand exactly what we were dealing with. And what conclusion did you reach? That you're exactly what we suspected from the beginning. Ambitious, manipulative, and completely unsuitable for someone in Kevin's position. The only surprise was how long it took you to show your true colors. I stood up slowly, the folder still clutched in my hands. Does Kevin know about this? Kevin knows what he needs to know. He's aware that we had some preliminary research done, which is standard practice for families like ours. He's not aware of the extent of our findings. You mean he doesn't know that you've been spying on me for 3 years? We prefer to think of it as protecting our son from making a catastrophic mistake. The pieces were finally falling into place. Every conversation, every subtle insult, every strategic intervention had been calculated based on information they'd gathered about my vulnerabilities and ambitions. They hadn't just been rejecting me, they'd been conducting psychological warfare using my own history against me. "I'm going to tell Kevin everything," I said. Kara laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, my dear girl, do you really think Kevin will choose you over his family? Do you think he'll risk his inheritance, his social position, his entire future for someone like you? Someone like me? Someone whose childhood was so traumatic that she's been in therapy for abandonment issues. Someone whose college grades were artificially inflated by sympathy from professors who felt sorry for the foster kid. Someone whose professional success is built on playing the victim card to gain special considerations." Each word was a precision strike designed to destroy my confidence, and they were working. Because buried in my deepest fears was the terrible possibility that maybe they were right. Maybe I had been playing the victim. Maybe my achievements weren't as legitimate as I'd believed. But then I remembered the research grant, the validation from peers who knew nothing about my background, the patients whose lives I genuinely improved through my work. "You're wrong," I said quietly. "Am I? Then why are you still here, Sharon? Why haven't you already left Kevin and found someone who actually values what you have to offer?" It was a question I couldn't answer, because the truth was too humiliating to acknowledge. I'd stayed because some part of me believed I deserved their treatment. But holding that folder full of evidence of their systematic cruelty, I finally understood that the problem wasn't my worth. The problem was their inability to recognize it. And I was done trying to prove myself to people who had decided from day one that I would never be enough. I walked out of that study carrying the investigation folder like evidence from a crime scene, which, in many ways, it was. Kara called after me, her voice sharp with authority, demanding that I return confidential family documents. But I was beyond caring about Kara's demands or Arthur's authority or even Kevin's feelings. I was finally completely done.
The drive to Kevin's apartment took 20 minutes, during which I rehearsed and discarded a dozen different ways to begin the conversation that would end our relationship. How do you tell someone you love that his family has been conducting surveillance on you for 3 years? How do you explain that every intimate detail you've shared has been weaponized against you? Kevin answered his door wearing the casual weekend clothes that had once made him seem approachable and down to earth. Now, I could see them for what they really were: the costume of someone who could afford to dress down because his real power lay in things that couldn't be taken away. "Sharon," he said, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure, "this is a nice surprise. I thought you were helping Mother with auction preparations today." "I was," I said, holding up the folder, "until I found this." His expression shifted from pleasure to confusion as he recognized his father's handwriting on the label. "What is that?" "It's a private investigation report about me, Kevin. 3 years worth of surveillance, background checks, and psychological analysis. Your parents have been spying on me since the day we met." Kevin's face went pale, but I couldn't tell if it was from shock or from being caught. That's not possible. My parents wouldn't what? Wouldn't hire investigators to dig into my foster care records? Wouldn't interview my colleagues under false pretenses? Wouldn't document my daily routines and track my friendships? I opened the folder and pulled out a photograph of myself leaving the hospital after a night shift. Because they did all of that and more. Kevin stared at the photograph like it was written in a foreign language. "Sharon, I don't understand. Why would they need to investigate you?" "Because they never had any intention of accepting me into the family. This was all an elaborate charade while they waited for you to come to your senses and choose someone more appropriate." I handed him the folder and watched his face as he flipped through the contents. With each page, his expression grew more stricken, more horrified. This was the Kevin I'd fallen in love with, the man who could still be shocked by cruelty, who hadn't been completely corrupted by his family's toxic worldview. "This is wrong," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is completely wrong. I had no idea they were doing this." "Didn't you?" I asked. "You never wondered how they always seemed to know exactly what buttons to push? How they always had just the right comment to make me feel small and out of place?" Kevin looked up from the folder, his eyes filled with something that might have been genuine remorse. "Sharon, I swear to you, I didn't know about any of this. Yes, I knew they had some concerns about our relationship, but I thought that was normal parent behavior. I never imagined they would do something like this." "But you're not surprised by what they found, are you?" I asked. "You're not shocked by their conclusions about my ambition being a threat to family hierarchy, because deep down, you agree with them. That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you defended my career to them? When was the last time you told them that my professional success makes you proud instead of making you uncomfortable?" Kevin was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, I found my answer. "Your mother told me today that you know what you need to know about their investigation. What exactly did you know, Kevin?" His shoulders sagged with the weight of his guilt. "I knew they had done some basic background research when we got serious. Father said it was standard practice, just to make sure there weren't any complications." "Complications like what?" "Like previous marriages or debt problems or criminal history. Normal things that families check. And you were okay with that?" I thought it was intrusive, but I understood their concerns. My position comes with responsibilities, and they wanted to make sure nothing in your past would create problems for the family. There it was, the admission I'd been dreading but expecting. Kevin had known his parents were investigating me, and he'd allowed it because he believed I was a risk that needed to be managed. "Kevin," I said slowly, "do you love me?" "Of course I love you. Sharon, how can you even ask that?" "Because someone who loves me wouldn't let his family treat me like a security threat. Someone who loves me would have told his parents that my past was none of their business. Someone who loves me would have protected me from this." Tears were starting to form in Kevin's eyes, and for a moment, I almost wavered, almost let myself believe that this could be salvaged, that love could overcome the systematic dehumanization I'd endured. But then I remembered Kara's cold smile, Arthur's casual dismissal of my achievements, and Kevin's repeated failures to stand up for me when it mattered. I can't marry you, I said. Sharon, please, we can fix this. I'll talk to my parents, I'll make them apologize. It's too late for apologies, Kevin. This isn't something that can be fixed with a conversation. Then what do you want me to do? I looked at this man who had been the center of my world for 3 years. This man who had never quite managed to see me as an equal. And I realized that there was nothing he could do. The damage was irreparable. I pulled the engagement ring from my finger and set it on Kevin's coffee table with a finality that seemed to echo through his silent apartment. The modest diamond caught the afternoon light, and for a moment, I remembered the joy I'd felt when he proposed, the hope that I could finally belong somewhere. Now I could see how small that dream had been. I have something to tell you, I said, turning back to face him. Something that's going to make this conversation much more interesting. Kevin looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. What? Remember that research grant I won? The one your parents called quite generous for a nursing project? He nodded. Well, it turns out that Dr. Chen wasn't just impressed with my research. She was so impressed that she recommended me for a position that I didn't even know existed. I pulled out my phone and showed him the email I'd received 2 days earlier. The World Health Organization wants me to head their new cardiac rehabilitation initiative. It's a 3-year position based in Geneva with a salary that's probably more than your father makes. Kevin's eyes widened as he read the email. Sharon, this is incredible. When did you... I found out Thursday. I was going to tell you, but then I found your parents' investigation folder and realized something important. I took the phone back and put it away. I don't need your family's approval anymore. I don't need their acceptance or their social connections or their validation. I've built something on my own that they could never give me and can never take away. The silence that followed was deafening. Kevin stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time, and maybe he was. For 3 years, he'd known me as someone who needed him, who was grateful for his attention, who was willing to diminish herself to fit into his world. That woman was gone. Are you going to take it? He asked finally. I already accepted. I start in 6 weeks. Kevin's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, and finally, something that looked like understanding. You're leaving. I'm leaving, I confirmed. I'm taking my unsuitable ambition and my problematic background, and I'm going to change lives on an international scale. While your parents are planning charity auctions, I'll be developing protocols that could save thousands of cardiac patients worldwide. I picked up my purse and headed for the door, but Kevin's voice stopped me. Sharon, wait. What about us? What about everything we've built together? I turned back to look at him one final time. Kevin, we didn't build anything together. You tolerated me while your parents researched ways to get rid of me. You managed me like a problem to be solved instead of loving me like a partner to be cherished. That's not a foundation for a life together. I do love you, he said desperately. I know I made mistakes, but I do love you. I know you do, I said softly. But you love the version of me that was small enough to fit into your family's expectations. You love the grateful, humble woman who was honored to be chosen by someone like you. And that woman never really existed. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, then turned back for one final message. Kevin, when you tell your parents about my new position, when you explain why our engagement is over, I want you to give them a message from me. What message? Tell them that the foster kid they tried so hard to investigate and control just became one of the most influential cardiac specialists in the world. Tell them that all their monitoring and strategic intervention accomplished was ensuring that when I achieved international recognition, their family name would be nowhere near it. I smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, it was a smile without apology or compromise. Tell them I said thank you for setting me free. The elevator doors closed on Kevin's stunned face, and as I descended toward the lobby, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood, The exhilarating terror of complete independence. I was finally free to become everything I was meant to be. The final confrontation came exactly 1 week later, in the most public way possible. I was at the hospital, working my last few shifts before transitioning to the WHO position, when the elevator doors opened to reveal Arthur and Kara Stilton standing in the cardiac unit lobby like avenging angels in designer clothing. Several of my colleagues stopped what they were doing to stare. The Stiltons were the kind of people who commanded attention wherever they went, and their presence in a working hospital was so incongruous that it felt almost surreal. "Sharon," Arthur said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "we need to speak with you privately." I looked around the unit, aware that every conversation had stopped and every eye was on us. Dr. Martinez, my supervisor, approached with a concerned expression. "Is everything all right, Sharon?" he asked, clearly recognizing the tension in the air. "Everything's fine, Dr. Martinez," I said calmly. "Mr. and Mrs. Stilton are Kevin's parents. I assume they want to discuss our recent breakup." "Indeed we do," Kara said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Kevin told us about your conversation and about this ridiculous WHO position you've apparently accepted." "Ridiculous?" Dr. Martinez repeated, his eyebrows rising. "Sharon, are you referring to the Cardiac Rehabilitation Initiative? That's one of the most prestigious appointments in international healthcare." I saw surprise flicker across Arthur's face. He hadn't expected my colleagues to be familiar with the WHO position, hadn't anticipated that my professional reputation might extend beyond what his investigators had documented. "Yes," I said, meeting Arthur's gaze directly. "That ridiculous position where I'll be developing cardiac care protocols for developing nations. Quite a step up from volunteer nursing at charity events, wouldn't you say?" Kara's lips tightened. "Sharon, you're making a terrible mistake. Kevin loves you, and you're throwing away a future with one of the city's most prominent families over a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I'd taken of their investigation folder. "Is this a misunderstanding, Kara? 3 years of surveillance and psychological profiling?" I held up the phone so my colleagues could see the photographs, the documentation of their systematic invasion of my privacy. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Dr. Martinez looked horrified. Several nurses gasped audibly. Even the orderlies who had gathered to watch the drama looked shocked. "You hired private investigators to spy on one of our staff members?" Dr. Martinez asked, his voice rising with indignation. "We conducted appropriate background research," Arthur said stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of this confrontation. "It's standard practice for families in our position."
Standard practice? Dr. Rodriguez, the head of cardiac surgery, had joined our growing audience. "You documented her childhood trauma and tracked her daily routines. That's not background research, that's stalking." I watched as the Stiltons' carefully constructed public image crumbled before their eyes. These people had built their reputation on philanthropic work and social responsibility, and here they were, being exposed as predators who had victimized someone they were supposed to welcome into their family. "Sharon," Kara said, her voice taking on a desperate edge, "surely we can discuss this privately." "No," I said firmly. "You've had 3 years to discuss things privately with me. You chose to investigate me secretly, judge me silently, and plan my removal quietly. Now, you can face the consequences publicly." Arthur stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Young lady, you have no idea who you're dealing with. My family has significant influence in this city. We can make things very difficult for you professionally." The threat hung in the air like toxic smoke, and I saw several of my colleagues exchange looks of disbelief. But I felt nothing but calm certainty as I responded. "Arthur," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the cardiac unit, "in 6 weeks, I'll be working for the World Health Organization, developing protocols that will be implemented in dozens of countries. Your influence extends to charity galas and country club memberships. Mine will extend to saving lives on a global scale."
I stepped closer to him, lowering my voice, but ensuring everyone could still hear. And if you ever try to interfere with my career again, I'll make sure every medical journal in the world knows exactly how the Stilton family treats healthcare professionals. I doubt that would be good for your philanthropic reputation. Arthur's face went white with rage. But before he could respond, Dr. Martinez stepped between us. I think this conversation is over, he said firmly. Mr. and Mrs. Stilton, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're disrupting patient care. As security arrived to escort them out, Kara made one final desperate attempt. Sharon, please, Kevin is devastated. He's talking about giving up his inheritance, his position with the family firm. You're destroying his life. I looked at this woman who had spent 3 years trying to destroy mine, and I felt something I'd never expected to feel toward her. Pity. Kara, I said quietly, Kevin's life isn't being destroyed. It's finally beginning, just like mine. As the elevator doors closed on their stunned faces, the cardiac unit erupted in applause. My colleagues surrounded me with congratulations and expressions of support, but all I could think about was how different this moment felt from every other confrontation with the Stiltons. For the first time, I hadn't been alone. For the first time, I'd had people who valued me fighting beside me. And for the first time, I'd won. 3 years later, I stood in the assembly hall of the World Health Organization headquarters in Geneva, addressing an audience of cardiac specialists from 47 countries. The presentation screen behind me displayed statistics that would have seemed impossible when I was Sharon Blake, the foster kid, trying desperately to fit into the Stilton family's world. The Geneva Cardiac Rehabilitation Protocol has now been implemented in over 200 hospitals worldwide, I announced. Patient survival rates have improved by an average of 34%, and long-term quality of life scores show unprecedented improvement across all demographic groups. The applause that followed wasn't polite charity gala clapping, it was the genuine appreciation of professionals recognizing revolutionary work. As I looked out at the audience, I saw Dr. Patricia Chen in the front row, beaming with pride at what her mentorship had helped create. After the presentation, during the reception, a familiar voice made me turn around. Sharon? Sharon Blake? It was Lizzie Hawkins, looking exactly as polished and privileged as she had 3 years ago, but somehow smaller than I remembered. She was attending the conference as part of her hospital board's philanthropic delegation, the kind of ceremonial role that came with social connections rather than medical expertise. Lizzie, I said with genuine warmth, what a surprise to see you here. I can't believe it's really you, she said, her eyes wide with something that looked like awe. When I saw Dr. Sharon Blake on the program, I thought it might be someone else with the same name. But here you are, giving keynote addresses at the WHO. Here I am, I agreed. This is incredible, Sharon. I mean, when Kevin told us you'd taken some international position, we had no idea it was anything like this. You're famous in the medical world. I noticed she didn't mention the circumstances of my departure, didn't reference the investigation folder or the public confrontation at the hospital. The Stiltons had apparently decided to rewrite that history into a more palatable narrative. How is Kevin? I asked, and I was pleased to discover that I felt only mild curiosity about the answer. He's different, Lizzie said carefully. After you left, he had some kind of awakening about his family. He moved to California, started working for a nonprofit focused on healthcare access for underserved communities. He's living in a studio apartment and driving a 10-year-old Honda. I smiled at the image of Kevin choosing purpose over privilege. Good for him. Kara and Arthur were devastated, of course. They keep hoping he'll come to his senses and return to the family business. But honestly, I've never seen him happier. And what about the family? How are they handling Kevin's transformation?
Lizzie's expression grew uncomfortable. They don't really talk about it, or about you. It's like those 3 years just disappeared from family history. Of course they did.
The Stiltons would never acknowledge that a foster kid had outgrown their ability to control her, that their systematic attempts to diminish someone had only revealed their own smallness. "Lizzie," I said gently, "can I ask you something? Did you ever know about the investigation they conducted on me?" Her face flushed red. "Sharon, we all knew they had concerns about Kevin's relationship, but I swear, none of us knew about the private investigators or the surveillance. When Kevin told us what they'd done, I was horrified." I believed her. Lizzie had been raised in the same world of casual cruelty and systemic privilege, but she hadn't been the architect of it. "I'm glad Kevin found his way," I said, and meant it. "He's a good man who was trapped in a toxic system. Breaking free from that takes real courage." As the reception wound down, I found myself thinking about the girl who had walked into that marble hallway 3 years ago, desperate to overhear evidence that she belonged somewhere. She would never have imagined standing in this room, surrounded by colleagues who respected her expertise and achievements that had nothing to do with who she married or which family accepted her. The foster care system had taught me that belonging wasn't something you could earn from other people. It was something you created for yourself through work that mattered and relationships built on mutual respect. I'd finally learned the lesson that had taken 45 years to understand. The right people don't make you smaller to fit into their world. They celebrate how much space you take up in your own. As I walked through the Swiss evening toward my apartment overlooking Lake Geneva, I thought about the scared young woman who had once believed that love meant shrinking herself to fit other people's expectations. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who knew that the only approval that mattered was her own. I am Dr. Sharon Blake, and this is the story of how I learned to treat myself like the treasure I'd always been, instead of the garbage they'd tried to convince me I was. Some people spend their whole lives trying to prove they're worthy of love. I'd finally learned to be worthy of my own respect, and that, it turned out, was worth more than all the Stilton family acceptance in the world.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.